Hey everyone, welcome back to English Inside Out. Today we're talking about three tiny words, three extremely common words, and honestly, three words that secretly control almost the entire English language: be, do, and have. And I know this might sound strange at first, because most learners think of these as basic verbs, beginner grammar, simple structures. But actually, these three words shape the way English sees reality. And once you understand the deeper logic behind them, a lot of English suddenly starts feeling much more natural.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the biggest frustrations learners have, because at some point, English starts feeling random. You hear things like, I am tired, I do exercise, I have finished, and your brain goes, why are these completely different systems?
Exactly. And then people start memorizing grammar tables, tense names, auxiliary verbs, endless rules, and honestly, that's usually where the confusion gets worse, because learners start seeing English as disconnected grammar pieces instead of one coherent system.
And honestly, I think this is the moment where many learners start feeling mentally exhausted with English, because they think there are too many rules. But what if the problem is not the rules? What if the problem is perspective?
Yeah, because English is actually much more visual and logical than people think. Native speakers are not constantly analyzing grammar formulas in real time. They're usually seeing states, actions, results. That's the deeper structure underneath a lot of English. So today, instead of memorizing grammar, we're going to explore a much simpler idea. Be, do, and have are three different ways of seeing reality. That's it. Three perspectives.
Exactly. And maybe the easiest way to visualize this is like this. Be describes your current reality. Do describes movement and action. Have describes results and experiences you carry with you. Actually, I think there's a really good metaphor for this. Imagine your life as a movie.
Okay, I like this already.
Be is like a still image from the movie, a snapshot, a frozen moment, like, I am tired. She is ready. They are late. Nothing is moving. You're simply describing reality.
Yeah, and then do is completely different. Do is movement, activity, the movie playing, like, I work. She studies. They run every morning. Now reality is moving. Something is happening.
Exactly. And then have introduces another layer, because now the action already happened. And what remains is the result, the experience, the completed reality. Like, I have finished. We have completed the project. She has seen the movie.
And honestly, this is where many learners suddenly feel, oh, English actually makes sense, because now these verbs stop feeling random. They become perspectives, different lenses.
Yeah. And once you start seeing English this way, grammar becomes much less mechanical, much less intimidating, because now you're not memorizing isolated rules. You're asking, am I describing a state, an action, or a result? That's a much more natural process.
Let's imagine a simple work situation. Your coworker asks, how's your day going? And notice how naturally these three systems appear. You might say, I'm exhausted. That's your current state. Then, I worked nonstop all morning. That's the action. And finally, I've already finished the report. That's the result.
Exactly. Same life, same day, same person, but English gives you three different ways to frame reality. And honestly, that's one of the most beautiful things about the language. The problem is that learners often mix these systems unconsciously. They say things like, I am work, I have tired, I do happy. And technically, the issue is not just grammar. The issue is the perspective doesn't match the meaning.
Exactly. And once you start feeling the logic behind these systems, a lot of mistakes disappear naturally, without memorizing huge grammar charts. So in this episode, we're going to explore how be describes reality and states, how do creates movement and action, how have connects to results and experience, why learners mix them up, and how to feel the difference naturally when speaking.
We'll look at work situations, daily routines, emotions, completed actions, common mistakes, and real comparisons that make English feel much more intuitive. And by the end of this episode, you probably won't see be, do, and have the same way again.
Yeah, because once the system clicks, English starts feeling much less random and much more logical.
All right, so let's start with the first perspective. And honestly, probably the calmest one of all.
Because before actions, before results, there's simply reality as it is. All right, so let's start with be. And honestly, this is probably the most fundamental system in English, because before you talk about actions, before you talk about results, you first describe what reality looks like right now, and that's exactly what the be system does.
Yeah, and I think this is where learners often overcomplicate things, because technically, be appears in a lot of grammar structures, but emotionally and visually, the idea is actually very simple. Be describes existence, reality, condition, state. So let's go back to the movie metaphor for a second. If your life is a movie, be is a still frame, a snapshot, a frozen image. Nothing is moving. You are simply observing reality.
Exactly. For example, I am tired. She is ready. They are nervous. The office is quiet. None of these sentences contain movement. Nothing is happening actively. You're simply describing how things are. Imagine walking into an office on Monday morning. One person looks stressed, another looks exhausted. Someone else is excited about a presentation. And naturally you say, she's stressed. He's exhausted. They're excited. These are all snapshots of reality.
Yeah, and that's why be often feels calm, static, observational. You're not watching action, you're describing a situation. And this is really important. The be system does not create movement by itself. It creates state. So when you say, I am busy, you are not describing action. You are describing your condition.
Exactly. And this is why sentences like, I am work, feel strange in English, because am belongs to state, work belongs to action. The systems don't match naturally there. Compare these. I am tired. State, I work a lot. Action, very different energies.
Yeah. First one feels like a photograph. Second one feels like movement. And honestly, that's one of the easiest ways to feel the difference. Now let's go a little deeper, because be is also heavily connected to identity. For example, I am Brazilian. She is a designer. He is my manager. Again, no movement. You're describing identity role existence.
Yeah, it's almost like labeling reality. You're defining who someone is, what something is, how things currently exist. That's the emotional function of be. Imagine you're at a networking event. Someone asks, so, what do you do? Interesting question already, because they use do for profession socially, but your answer usually uses be. I'm a project manager. I'm a designer. I'm an engineer. You describe identity first.
Yeah, and that's fascinating actually, because English constantly shifts perspective depending on focus, and native speakers do this automatically, without thinking about grammar terminology. Another important thing about be, it appears constantly with emotions. For example, I'm nervous. She's angry. We're excited. They're confused. And again, these are not actions. You're not actively doing nervousness. You're experiencing a state.
Exactly. And this is why I do nervous. Sounds impossible emotionally because nervousness is not movement, it's condition. Honestly, a really useful trick is this. Whenever you hear a be sentence, try imagining a still image, like a paused movie frame. For example, the meeting is tense. You can almost visualize the room immediately. Nobody even needs to move. The reality already exists.
Yeah, And I think that's why B often feels descriptive and atmospheric. It paints the emotional environment. Now let's bring this into workplace English, because professionals use be constantly to describe status, availability, pressure, situations. For example, I'm available after lunch. The client is unhappy. We're behind schedule. The team is ready. These are all states of reality.
Yeah. And notice how none of these require visible movement. You're simply describing the current condition of things. That's the heart of the be system. Honestly, I think one reason learners struggle with English is because they try to translate words individually, but native speakers usually think in perspective. Are we describing reality, movement, or result? That's a much more natural framework.
Imagine your manager asks, "What's happening with the client?" You might answer, "The client is frustrated right now." That's not action, that's atmosphere, state, current emotional reality.
Let's compare these two. I am stressed. I work too much. First, state. Second, cause, action, and together, they create a fuller picture of reality.
Exactly. And that's where English becomes really expressive, because you can separate condition from movement very clearly. So if we simplify everything about be, state condition, identity existence, emotional reality.
Yeah, and maybe the best way to visualize it is be freezes reality for a moment so you can observe it. That's the feeling.
All right, so now that we understand how English describes reality, let's move into something completely different.
Because now reality starts moving. Now things happen. Now energy appears. And that's exactly where the do system begins.
All right, so now let's move into the do system. And honestly, this is where English suddenly becomes dynamic, because unlike be, do creates movement, action, energy. Things are no longer frozen. Now something is happening.
Yeah, and you can actually feel this difference emotionally. The be system feels still, observational, but the do system feels active. You can almost see movement when people speak. So if be is a still photograph, do is the movie playing. Now the camera is moving. People are acting. Reality is unfolding in time.
Exactly. For example, I work. She studies. They run every morning. We solve problems. These sentences move. You can visualize activity immediately. Imagine the office again. Earlier, we described the atmosphere. The team is stressed. The manager is nervous. That was state. Now imagine movement. The team works late. People answer emails. The manager calls the client. Now the movie is playing.
Exactly. And this is why action verbs naturally belong to the do world, because actions create movement, process, activity, energy. That's the emotional logic underneath it.
And honestly, I think one of the biggest breakthroughs learners have is realizing this. English separates what reality is from what reality does. That's a huge distinction.
Compare these. I am exhausted. State. I work nonstop. Action. First one. Photograph. Second one. Movie scene.
Yeah, and together, they create a complete picture. One describes your condition, the other describes the movement creating that condition. Now let's bring this into daily life, because once you notice it, the do system is everywhere. For example, I drive to work. She cooks dinner. We study English. They exercise every morning. These are all activities unfolding in time.
Yeah, and unlike be, these verbs naturally create visual motion. You can imagine the driving, the typing, the studying, the movement itself. That's the feeling of the do system. Imagine someone asks, "What do you do during the week?" Interesting question again, because now they're not asking about your state. They're asking about repeated activity. So you answer, "I work from home. I study at night. I go to the gym." These are movement-based realities.
Imagine someone asks, "What do you do during the week?" Interesting question again, because now they're not asking about your state. They're asking about repeated activity. So you answer, I work from home. I study at night. I go to the gym. These are movement-based realities. And another important thing, do is not only physical movement. Mental actions also belong here. For example, I think about work constantly. She analyzes data. We discuss ideas. You may not be physically running, but mentally, activity is happening.
Exactly. So the important thing is not physical motion specifically. It's activity. Process. Something unfolding. Imagine looking at someone's computer screen at work. Emails opening, documents changing, messages appearing, people typing quickly. That's do energy, the system of movement and activity.
Now there's another interesting thing here. Sometimes English uses the word do itself for emphasis. For example, I do understand. We do need more time. She does care. And emotionally, this adds force, certainty, intensity.
Yeah. It's almost like underlining the action emotionally, like, this is true. This really exists. I'm serious. And native speakers use this all the time in conversation. Imagine your manager says, you don't seem interested in this project. And you respond, no, I do care about it. Now the emphasis becomes emotional. You're reinforcing the truth of the action.
Exactly. And this is why do often carries energy and force even beyond simple action. It pushes the sentence forward. Honestly, I think this is one reason English feels very alive when native speakers talk. The language constantly shifts between state, movement, result, and that creates rhythm.
Let's compare something simple. Imagine someone asks about your day. You could say, I'm busy today. State. Or, I'm answering emails all morning. Activity and motion. Different perspectives, different energies.
Exactly. One shows the condition, the other shows the process happening inside that condition. That's a really important distinction. And this is why learners sometimes create strange combinations like I am work, because subconsciously, they mix state with action.
Yeah. And once you understand the emotional logic, the mistake suddenly feels unnatural automatically. Because now your brain recognizes, wait, this system doesn't match the meaning. That's much more powerful than memorizing correction rules. So if we simplify everything about the do system, action, movement, activity, process, energy unfolding in time.
Yeah. And maybe the easiest way to feel it is do makes reality move. That's the core sensation underneath the whole system. All right, so now we've explored reality as it is and reality in motion. Now let's move into the third perspective, and honestly, this is the one that suddenly makes English feel much deeper.
Because now we're no longer inside the action. Now we're looking at what remains after the action is complete. All right, so now let's move into the have system. And honestly, this is probably the moment where many learners suddenly realize, oh, English is much more logical than I thought. Because have introduces a completely different perspective. Not state, not movement, result.
Yeah, and emotionally, the have system feels different from the other two immediately. Because now the action already happened, the movement is over, and what matters now is what exists because of that action. So let's continue the movie metaphor. If be is the still image and do is the movie playing, then have is what you carry with you after the movie scene ends. The completed reality, the consequence, the experience.
Exactly. For example, I have finished the report. She has seen the movie. We have completed the project. In all these examples, the action is already done. What matters now is the result that exists in the present. Imagine you've been working all week on a huge presentation, late nights, endless emails, meetings, stress. That's all do energy, action, movement, process. But then Friday arrives. you send the final file. And now you say, I have finished the presentation. The action stopped. Now the focus is the completed result.
Exactly. And that's why have often feels satisfying emotionally, because it carries completion, achievement, experience, and honestly, this is one of the most important emotional differences in English. Do lives inside the action. Have looks back at the action from the present moment. That's the key shift.
Compare these. I work on the project. Movement. I have finished the project. Result. Very different perspectives.
Yeah. First sentence feels open and active. Second sentence feels complete, resolved, finalized. Now let's go a little deeper, because have is also deeply connected to experience. For example, I have seen that movie. She has visited Japan. We have worked together before. Again, the action itself is over, but the experience still exists in your life.
Yeah. It's almost like collecting experiences and carrying them with you. The moment passed, but its effect remains part of your reality. That's the emotional feeling of have. Imagine your memory like a shelf. Every experience becomes something you carry. So when you say, I have traveled to Italy, you're not describing the trip itself anymore. You're describing the experience you now possess.
And that's why have often feels reflective. It connects past action to present identity. And this is where learners often misunderstand things, because they think have is just past tense grammar. But emotionally, it's really about present relevance. Why does this past action matter now? That's the deeper idea. Imagine your manager asks, "Can we send the report today?" You answer, "Yes, I have already finished it." Now, the important thing is not the past action itself. The important thing is the report is ready now. That's the focus.
Exactly. And honestly, that's why the have system feels more connected to consequence than movement. Let's compare these carefully. I work all day. Focus on activity. I am exhausted. Focus on current state. I have finished everything. Focus on result 3, completely different lenses on the same reality.
And once you start seeing English this way, the language suddenly feels organized instead of random. Honestly, I think one reason learners struggle with English tenses is because nobody explains the emotional perspective underneath them. People memorize structures, but they don't feel state, movement, completion, and that's the real logic, holding everything together.
Imagine someone asks, why are you so calm about this presentation? You might say, I have done this many times before. Interesting sentence, because now your past experience creates present confidence.
Yeah, and that's a perfect example of how have connects past experience to current reality. The experience still matters now, and this is why sentences like, I have tired, feel strange emotionally, because tiredness is not a completed result you possess. It's a state, so English naturally wants, I am tired.
And once learners understand the emotional logic, a lot of these mistakes start correcting themselves naturally, because now the systems feel different internally. So if we simplify everything about the have system, result completion experience carried into the present consequence reality after the action.
Yeah, and maybe the easiest way to feel it is this. Have shows what remains after movement ends. That's the emotional core of the system. All right, so now we've explored state, movement, and result. But now comes the really interesting part.
Because this is where everything suddenly connects. And honestly, this is usually the moment where English finally starts making sense emotionally.
All right, now comes the really important part, because up until now, we explored be, do, and have separately. But real English becomes powerful when you see how these systems work together, and honestly, this is usually the exact moment where learners suddenly think, wait, English actually makes sense.
Yeah, Because now you stop seeing these as random grammar pieces, and you start seeing them as different lenses for describing the same reality. That's the real breakthrough. Let's imagine a simple situation. You've had an exhausting day at work. Now watch how English changes perspective. I am tired. Current state, reality right now. I work too much. Action, process, repeated movement. I have worked all day. Completed experience with present consequence.
And what's fascinating is this. All three sentences connect to the same life situation, but each one focuses on something different. Be describes the condition. Do describes the activity. Have describes the completed result of the activity. Imagine the movie visually. First, I work all day. You see movement, typing, meetings, calls, stress, coffee, action. Then, I have worked all day. The movement stops. Now you're looking back at the completed experience. And finally, I am tired. Now we freeze reality again and observe the state created by everything before.
Exactly. And honestly, that's such a beautiful way to understand English, because the language constantly shifts perspective depending on what matters emotionally in that moment. Let's do another one. Imagine a big project at work. We are stressed. State. We work nonstop. Movement. We have finished the project. Result. 3 different perspectives. Same reality.
Yeah, and once you feel this internally, grammar starts becoming intuitive because now your brain naturally asks, what am I focusing on? Not, which grammar rule comes now? Huge difference, honestly. I think this is one of the biggest misunderstandings in language learning. People think fluency comes from memorizing forms, but real fluency often comes from understanding, perspective. What angle am I showing reality from?
Imagine your boss asks, what's happening with the client? You could answer in 3 completely different ways. The client is frustrated. State, we work on the issue right now. Action, we have solved the main problem. Result.
And emotionally, each sentence creates a different focus immediately. One describes atmosphere, one describes movement, one describes completion. And honestly, this is exactly why learners create strange combinations sometimes, like, I am work, I have busy, I do tired. Because subconsciously, the systems get mixed together.
Yeah. But once the emotional logic becomes clear, those sentences start feeling strange naturally. Not because you memorized a correction chart, but because your brain recognizes this perspective doesn't match the meaning. That's much deeper learning. Let's imagine someone asks, how's life lately? You could answer, I'm stressed lately. State, I work too much. Movement, I've taken on too many projects. Result with present consequence, completely different emotional angles.
Exactly, and that's why advanced English speakers sound so flexible. They know how to shift perspective naturally. Honestly, I think this is where English stops feeling mechanical, because now it feels expressive. You're no longer assembling grammar pieces. You're choosing how reality is framed, and that's a much more human process.
All right, let's put everything together in a realistic office conversation.
How's the new campaign going?
We're a little stressed right now because we work on multiple deadlines at the same time. But we have already completed the final presentation.
Look at that flow. State, we're stressed. Movement, we work on multiple deadlines. Result, we have completed the presentation. That's real English perspective in action.
So if we simplify the entire episode into one central idea, be describes reality. Do describes movement. Have describes completed reality.
Or maybe even simpler, be shows what is, do shows what happens, have shows what remains.
Yeah, and honestly, once you start feeling those 3 perspectives, English suddenly becomes much more logical.
All right, so before we finish, let's make this practical one last time.
Because now we want to help you actually feel these systems naturally in your own English. All right, so before we finish, let's zoom out for a second. Because today was never really about grammar tables, tense, names, complicated rules. And honestly, I think that's the most important thing to remember.
Yeah, because what we explored today was something much deeper. We explored perspective, the way English looks at reality. And once you start understanding that, the language stops feeling random.
So let's simplify everything one last time. Be describes reality and state. Do describes movement and action. Have describes result and experience.
Or visually, be is the still image, do is the movie playing, have is what remains after the scene ends.
And honestly, that one idea alone can organize a huge part of English in your mind.
Because now, instead of asking, which random grammar rule do I use? You can ask, what perspective am I showing? Am I describing a state, an action, or a result? That's a much more intuitive way to think about English.
For example, I am stressed. Current reality, I work nonstop. Movement, I have finished the project. Completed result, same life. 3 completely different lenses.
And honestly, I think this is what real fluency starts to feel like. Not memorizing grammar mechanically, but understanding how meaning is organized. That's when English starts feeling natural instead of chaotic.
Because language is not just vocabulary and rules, it's perspective. It's how people frame, experience, emotion, action, reality itself. And these 3 systems are at the center of that in English.
So maybe the biggest idea from today is this: English is not random, it's a system.
Yeah, and once the system clicks, everything becomes much less intimidating. So before we go, we want you to try something really simple in the comments. Write 1 sentence with be, 1 with do, and 1 with have about your day today.
Yeah. For example, your current state and action you did today and a result or experience you now have because of it, that's the perfect way to start feeling the system naturally. And honestly, don't worry about being perfect. The goal is not perfect grammar. The goal is starting to see English differently. That's the real breakthrough.
And if this episode helped you finally understand be, do, and have in a more natural way, share it with someone who still thinks English is completely random.
And don't forget to subscribe for real English
Real conversations.
and real progress. See you in the next episode.
Bye, everyone.